As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
The more parents are involved in their sibling relationships, the more their children will fight and bicker with each other. And not just fight and bicker with each other, but also the less closeness they'll have because there's somebody in the middle of their relationship mediating it, which is a way of preventing closeness. And it's not simply because parents involve themselves that creates this environment. It's how parents involve themselves.
That was Jonathan Caspi on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
I'm Yael Schoenbrunn, a clinical psychologist, faculty at Brown University, author of Work, Parent Thrive, and a biweekly newsletter on relationships.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, the Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, listeners. I'm jumping right into my interview with our guest today to talk about raising siblings. But stay tuned for our co-host debrief at the end of the interview, where we'll discuss how we used ideas from the conversation in our real lives. Surprisingly, in over 400 episodes, including a big chunk of parenting content, we haven't yet covered sibling relationships. So I'm so thrilled to welcome sibling expert Jonathan Caspi to the podcast today to talk about his book, Raising Loving Siblings, How to Stop the Fighting and Help Your Kids Connect, which sounds like a great promise. Jonathan Caspi, PhD, MSW, is professor of family science and human development at Montclair State University in New Jersey. Dr. Caspi is an internationally recognized sibling expert. In addition to researching, writing, and teaching about families and siblings, he has been a family therapist for over 30 years and has a private practice in New Jersey. Welcome to Psychologists Off the Clock, Jonathan.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
You start the book with a fundamental truth of parenting siblings that I feel like we have to start with to set the stage for the rest of the discussion. But it may feel like a gut punch to readers and listeners. A lot of sibling conflict is because of us, the parents. And I know this from my training in family systems and child clinical psychology, of course. But as a mom, it was still hard to hear. Because this is such a fundamental awareness to start with, I wanted to give you a chance to lay the foundation by explaining why so much sibling conflict is actually about the parents.
Oh, it's a great question. And you're 100% right that it's very hard to hear those kinds of things. I'm a parent too. The thing about parenting is this. Number one, it's incredibly hard. And number two, when you have siblings, in some ways, it's like a lose-lose proposition. And we'll get into that, I'm sure, in our discussion. But, treating them fairly isn't necessarily fair for them. and treating them not fairly is certainly not fair for them. And so, if you've ever tried to cut a birthday cake exactly equal, and when you say you're getting the same, they might not agree that they're getting the same, right? So everybody needs to cut themselves a little bit of break, and it's a hard endeavor. But if you take a look at research, you'll see that the more parents are involved in their sibling relationships, the more their children will fight and bicker with each other. And not just fight and bicker with each other, but also the less closeness they'll have because there's somebody in the middle of their relationship mediating it, which is a way of preventing closeness. And it's not simply because parents involve themselves that creates this environment. It's how parents involve themselves. And unfortunately, one of the things that we do reflexively is one of two things. One is we either just yell things that are pretty useless, like, be nice to your sister, you two go to your room, you stay away from each other, can't you just learn to share?
Just get along.
Just get along. Yeah. And those, of course, don't teach anything. And they represent, your own discontent, which makes the kids even fight more. Plus, you're giving it that attention, which makes them fight even more. And, the second piece is that parents often come in on behalf of one of the children, usually the younger one, and they'll say things like, you're older, you should know better, share with your little brother or sister, let them use the toy and you can use it later. And we don't realize it maybe while we're doing it because especially if there's like physical aggression, you go to protect the smaller one. But what it does is say, I'm on the smaller one's side, and it makes an outsider of the other child, which makes them more resentful. And then you get more conflict and less closeness. So there are other reasons too, but those are the two biggies.
Yes. And we will get a little more into that as we keep talking. But I also wanted to pull out one thing that I think is really critical to highlight, and that is also the importance of the parental relationship and the data around healthier partner relationships are related to less conflict with siblings. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, I'm glad that you raised that because you don't actually see that in a lot of writing. But if you talk to almost any therapist, they'll point this out, is that when parenting couples, husbands and wives and other parenting couples aren't getting along very well, the siblings will not get along very well. And there is in research a link between marital conflict and sibling conflict. It makes a more stressful environment. And when kids are more stressed out, they tend to get a little more aggressive and irritated and sort of take it out on the sibling. But sometimes they're also just acting out the parents' conflict. And the other issue is that when parents are not on the same team, they each have their own ideas about how to parent. They end up undermining each other's authority. So if one parent says, no, you can't have the cookie, and the other parent says, no, it's okay, have the cookie, the child learns that they can play the terrain to get their cookies.
Right.
And then they'll figure out which parent is the easier parent to go to. And so, the same is true when siblings are fighting with each other. If one is like, well, I always fought with my brother when I was little and never did me any harm. What they've done is then undermine their partner who's trying to intervene. And kids pay attention and they play the terrain. I mean, I would too if I could get cookies.
Right. I mean, we know as therapists specializing in kids that children know how to get their needs met. Right?
Absolutely.
And cookies are a big need. So they're going to get that cookie.
They are for me.
So one thing we do in psychology is distinguish between normal and abnormal. So I want to also have that discussion before we get into strategies. And that is that sibling conflict is normal. And I don't think, after reading your book, that the point is to coach parents to respond so that their kids never have any conflict again. So how would you distinguish between regular, non-concerning sibling conflict versus that which should set off alarms that we do need to pay more attention and make some changes?
Yeah, sibling punching and fighting, pushing, when one is trying to harm the other one and is engaging in violent or abusive behavior, is not only highly problematic, but it's also really prevalent. In fact, the most common form of child maltreatment is perpetrated by a sibling. It outnumbers parental violence or abuse of children, domestic violence, and peer bullying combined. And that's how widespread it is. And part of it is because parents do say, oh, it's normal. And so, but if you try to think of any relationship in which somebody's allowed to punch a child, the only one, and we could break it down, but the only one is a brother or sister. We don't let parents do it. We are teachers in most states anyway, and so on. And when we watch kids fighting with each other, we have to pay attention that it's not getting into the intent to harm, because that's when it becomes violent or abusive. And so, normally this question comes up around like wrestling. Mm-hmm. And so, boys often like to wrestle with each other. And there's reasons why. It's also developmentally expected that boys are going to wrestle. It's part of their play. But often it crosses the line into, I'm trying to harm my brother or sister. And when it does, that's when parents need to intervene. Before then, parents don't. And also there needs to be rules, and that needs to be talked about and put on the table. Like, it's okay if you guys wrestle and you're having fun. But the minute one of you is starting to think that the other one is trying to hurt you, then you stop, because we don't want people to be victimized in our own house. Our job as parents is to keep them safe.
Right. So the idea of like sibling bullies I've run across, where we don't usually apply that concept to sibling relationships, but it actually is a phenomenon that is quite concerning because it does lead to pretty bad outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, it's very prevalent. In fact, most siblings on some level are bullying each other. And it's much more prevalent amongst toddlers and younger kids to be physically aggressive. But even college-age students say that they've tried to resolve a conflict in the past year using physical violence. And the numbers are, between 60 and 70% generally. So we're talking about a lot of people are using physical violence with siblings where they wouldn't anywhere else.
Right.
And, it's a very deceiving kind of thing. And most parents don't believe it. And their kids go and say, my brother's bullying me or is bossing me around or being mean to me. They often dismiss it as kind of normal. But if it's creating that kind of an environment, you see other problems too. It shows up as academic problems, peer problems, anxiety, depression, so on. And so I would recommend for everybody who's listening that if a child says to you, my brother or sister is trying to hurt me, and not just physically, but verbally too, that you take it seriously.
Right. What should parents look out for? I mean, there's sort of the typical rough and tumble and younger kids who will act out physically with a punch or a kick. What should parents be looking for with bullying behavior? What would they potentially observe beyond their child coming to them saying, my sibling's trying to hurt me?
Yeah. So the first thing that I would recommend for everybody, that you have a no violence rule in your house, which means you starting very, very young. There's, even when the child is 2 or 3, there's no pushing or punching. There's no name calling. There's no trying to insult, because verbal abuse is very detrimental as well. And when siblings are calling each other bad names, fat, ugly, stupid, so on, they really stay in the people's brains for a very long time. And so none of that should be permitted. Any verbal or physical attempt to hurt another person, your home should be safe.
Yep.
And that should start very, very early, because what we know about aggressive behavior is that it escalates. It starts with name calling, and then it turns to shoving, and then it turns to punching. And so the earlier you catch it, the better off you are. And so I would start first with a no violence rule. The other thing related to bullying is that sometimes we see it. We see kids punching and shoving and hitting each other and calling each other names. And sometimes it shows up in ways that are less visible, because it may happen outside the parent's awareness. And so in that case, maybe the biggest clue is if one child is afraid or is really doing everything they can to avoid being in the presence of a brother or sister. This shows up particularly when, for kids who are coming home from school and there's no parents in the house, that they're alone with their siblings. And if they're finding reasons not to go home, like they want to stay at school later, which is strange for most kids, or they're always trying to go to a friend's house, or you see them using avoidance behavior, you pay attention.
I think that's really, really helpful. Now, in terms of normal sibling conflict, What is that? I mean, you share that according to the research, most conflicts are due to shared living environment and not competition for parents' attention. So there's plenty of conflict that has nothing to do with us. So what is normal?
Yeah, that's always an interesting question, right? So yes, if you put two people in a room together, whether it's kids or adults, romantic couples, roommates in college, they're going to run into areas of disagreement and they're going to run into conflict. And you just expect that that's part of life, is that sometimes you're going to disagree on how things go down. And so teaching kids early how to manage conflict in a productive way is important, because it's not just for their siblings, it's for all relationships in life. And it is true that a lot of kids will fight with each other, over parental attention and investment. And some argue that's how we're wired. But a lot of it is just day to day. We're in the same room. You have a toy. I want to play with the same toy. And now we're fighting with each other. Or I want to sit in the front seat of the car. No, I want to sit in the front. And that's not necessarily competing for parents' favor or attention. Or it's just, I want it my way and you're in my way. That you would expect to see. I think that's normal. What is not normal is when conflict is ongoing and it's disrupting the whole family and you just can't go anywhere without bickering, because that's no longer about shared space. There's something else going on. And usually it's either somebody's getting rewarded for that behavior, right? So they're initiating this negative behavior, this problem behavior, because they're, either the parent is coming to their side or they're feeling powerful or, they're getting things their way ultimately. And that's when the conflict becomes abnormal.
So part of it, and I think this is helpful for listeners to wrap their heads around the features, right? The features of when they should start to be concerned and be motivated to take some action for change. And one of those is the frequency. How much is it dominating family life and getting in the way of a more harmonious coexistence as a family?
Yeah, frequency and severity. I would include that too, but absolutely. I mean, if you're annoyed that you can't go anywhere and without the kids messing it up, that's a problem, right? Because you want to have a nice, peaceful, happy household. And it's not that we just want kids not to fight. We also want them to be good friends and buddies and lifelong. The benefits of having close relationships are so important across the lifespan in ways that people often underestimate.
Right. And that's the whole purpose of this. It's actually not just about our day-to-day. It's about the long-term relationships that our children are developing with each other. So say a little more, because I think this is a good motivator for parents also to be like, this is what I want for my children as adults. What does the research say about those adulthood sibling relationships and how they're important?
Oh, yeah. This is my favorite subject. I write a lot and I talk a lot about sibling violence, but this one I like the upside of it, not the dark side. But the thing about close sibling relationships and why we want our kids, I've never really met parents who are like, I don't want my kids to be friends. Everybody wants their kids to be like best friends and buddies. And it makes us so happy when we see them like really in a moment where they're feeling like they're laughing together or they're close. And so there's some of the research is really compelling and surprising. For example, kids who have good relationships with their brothers and sisters not only have better relationships with peers, but if they are experiencing poor peer relationships and isolation and even being bullied at school, having a good sibling relationship can buffer the negative effects. In other words, the anxiety and depression and things that come along with being bullied and isolated are either much less or almost zero compared to groups that do have friends and are not getting bullied. And so you see what the technical word is compensatory effects, but this buffering effect, you see that across lots of things. For example, in families of divorce, children often fall behind for a brief period of time. They end up doing a little worse in school and worse in relationships. They experience more psychological disruption unless they have a really close relationship with a sibling. So, for therapists, we often, when we're working with divorcing families, we'll focus on how do you cope with your parents not being together and what's your emotional experience and so on. But if we work on building a positive sibling relationship, that may actually be more powerful in the long run for not only getting through the divorce, but setting them up for a life of, support and companionship. And, you see people in their middle age, they have better relationships with their spouses when they have good relationships with siblings. They report being happier. They're actually, this is a funny thing, but they actually are more successful in many other ways because happy people tend to get promoted more. They tend to make more money because they get promoted more. People think that money buys happiness. It's actually the other way around. Happy people end up in places where the hiring people want you.
Mm-hmm.
And then in old age, it's like super critical because there's research that shows that a good relationship with a sibling increases lifespan and happiness at the end of the, life course. Because, when you don't have your parents around anymore and a lot of your friends have died off, having a sibling provides a lot of support. Plus, they're the shared memory of life. When things happen to you in childhood, the person you talk to is your sibling and you say, remember that moment?
Yeah.
And they say, yes. And then when they're not here anymore, it's like, was that real? And so they serve a very important grounding function in that way too. And so there's so many, and not just tip of the iceberg, there's so many super positive things to good relationships with your siblings that are important. So we don't want to say to our kids, stay away from each other, because that only builds more distance. We want to, stop the fight, but also help them build more closeness.
Yeah, I love that. It's not just about the harm reduction or focusing on the negative and what to decrease, but what are we actually trying to cultivate in our children when we have the influence to do so. So we have this opportunity in this window of time that they're living in the same house with us. But that's actually a minority of their lifespan, but a very formative period as well. So I love framing this as a huge opportunity, not just, this is so stressful, right?
I appreciate that. And I like the way you framed it. Bringing us full circle actually back to your first question about how parents actually make their kids sometimes have more conflict. I'm a college professor, so I ask my students often, about, the nature of the relationships. And so many will tell me, like, we used to fight all the time when we were kids. And now that we're in our 20s, we're like best friends. And they're like, what happened? How did that happen? And I go, your parents aren't in the middle of your relationship anymore.
Exactly. You're not living with those parents.
And I'm sorry, I'm a parent too, so I get it.
One of the main sources of sibling conflict that you touched on, but I think is worth digging into, is perceived favoritism. So I have 3 kids, and they are 15, 13, and 10, so fairly close in age. And I hear a lot, so-and-so is your favorite. Honestly, though, I have to say, and I don't know if this is just my bias, I feel like they're trying to mess with me because they know I get upset about it, because they do it in this sort of like playful, taunting way.
Oh, they do it together. I like that they're joined together. We want siblings to join together.
They actually gang up on me a fair bit. So I'm just going to take that as a good sign.
Hey, absolutely.
So let's talk about how favoritism plays a role in sibling conflict. But I want to start with a quote I loved so much. I put it on my Instagram, which is, children are different people with different temperaments, talents, and needs. Therefore, parents must treat their children different. Treating them the same would be unfair. So how does favoritism play a role in sibling conflict?
Yeah, I'm glad that you introduced it with that, because, we are not the same with our kids, and it's impossible to be. And as you just said, every kid has their own unique talents and things that they struggle with. And, think of it this way. If one child is really struggling in math and you get them a math tutor, you wouldn't get your other kids math tutors who are not. And that would just be silly. So we don't treat 2-year-olds the same way we treat 8-year-olds. So if you have a 5 or 6 year gap, it's going to be really clear. And so we're always treating our kids differently. And also we're different with our firstborns than we are with our second and third, that they have different parents. Firstborn parents are uptight people. They read books like What to Expect When You're Expecting, and they drive home from the hospital super slow, and the baby coughs, and they rush him right over to the doctor. By the time you're on your 3rd or 4th, you're like, all right, I'm in the fast lane heading home.
They'll be
I don't
fine.
even know if I did the car seat correctly. And you're just looser, and you've been down that road, and you're not calling the doctor right away. So the kids have different parents. It's impossible for us to treat them the same, but they do sometimes pay close attention to the differential treatment. And when they don't understand why one child seems to be getting more favorable treatment, that's when it becomes favoritism. And so there's two possibilities. One, it's just perceived and it's not true, right? They just don't recognize that the intent is to be fair, and they're not experiencing it that way. And the second is that it really is happening, and that one child is getting more favorable treatment. And that's a tough one for parents in two ways. One is we have to be open to the fact that maybe we're doing it. So for example, if you're really into like football and your child decides to play football, you might get super excited and go to all the games and the practices. And then you spend time at dinner talking about like plays, and the other sibling might be like, hey, you're not that interested in me and my artwork or the things that I'm interested in. Right. And so we might not realize that, what our own personal excitement is shaping your children's perceptions. And the other is sometimes, and I know this is sort of a crude fact, but sometimes we find some kids more likable than others. And so we behave that way with them. And then the kids that are acting in less likable ways, we change our behavior that reinforces their unlikability. And so, a very simple example is when kids are protesting about favoritism, they'll go, "It's not fair. I don't like that. You treat him better." And you're like, "Oh my God, you're so annoying. Stop complaining."
Right.
It's like it makes them even less, right? Most parents will go like, "Oh, you're right. I should really think about this." But when they're not in the middle of complaining about it, it is important sometimes to sit down with kids and say, "Hey, I've heard you voice this multiple times. Let's talk about it. I really want to hear your perspective," because then you're bringing them in closer. You're not dismissing them and pushing them away, which only makes them feel more like there's favoritism happening.
Exactly. And I just want to zero in on that point because it's so important. If we are remembering the framework of closeness versus distance and how certain types of sibling conflict will create more distance between the parent and the child, and to be aware of that, we need to lean in to increasing closeness.
100%. And there's even research out that shows that, parent-child closeness is linked to sibling closeness.
Right. The healthier and closer each relationship is, it's better for the family as a whole.
Very much so, yes. I know it's not so obvious, but it's not what people think about. I mean, even when I started in writing about this many years ago, we would think about siblings as their own entity that were sort of disconnected from they're fighting with each other. We have to deal with their fighting, and didn't necessarily see how, the nature of the parent-child relationship was really influencing the nature of the sibling relationship.
One tip I was surprised at, because I feel like it's counter to so much advice I've read before, is to not play it neutral. So everything I've read about, not being perceived that you have favorites is to just not even really go there with your child and just say, "No, I love everyone the same," right? So what's problematic about that?
Well, it's a lie.
Yeah, right. It is a lie. Kids are very smart.
Yeah. I mean, look, the love part, maybe, right? I mean, we are very, we have a lot of emotional investment in our children, but, we do click with some children more than others. We feel more warmly towards some. Some are, have personalities that we, either jibe with or kind of run against it. Some parents like a feisty child, some want a calm child. So they're just different, and we feel differently about them, like we do all relationships in our life. And sometimes it changes, day to day or week to week. It doesn't mean like a parent is permanently like, I like this child more than this child, but it might be like this week, we seem to be really hitting it off and getting along, and I'm really enjoying time with this child. And so there's a lot of fluid work in families. But the interesting thing is when you ask in research about parents and how warmly they feel with their kids or click with their kids, or, if their kids are easy or not, if they favor the easier child. Most parents actually do nominate a child. And when you ask kids almost always nominate or say that there is favoritism or something, not all of it, but most. And the interesting thing is the kids almost always get it wrong. They guess wrong which one the parents nominate. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So it's a very complicated field, a topic, because the word favoritism is so fuzzy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, does it mean I like you more, or does it mean you have more privilege? Does it mean I spend more time with you? Because, kids who are difficult get a lot of parental time.
Right.
And so the easygoing kids can easily say, oh, the difficult child is the favorite because mom and dad only talk about them and they just pay attention to them all the time. And then, of course, the difficult child says, no, they like you better because they never yell at you and they give you more permission to do more things than they give me. And then, of course, you have one parent might favor one child and another parent might favor another. And so it's a very, very fuzzy, complicated topic. But what you want to do is being able to take seriously what their child's experiences are and not dismiss them. And then you can have like a real conversation about, yeah, I do pay more attention to your brother right now because he's really struggling, but it doesn't mean, I don't want to be with you or don't love you. And then you can have those kind of conversations.
And those conversations create closeness.
100%.
So it's a win-win.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into some of the strategies you lay out in your book, which I appreciate. Your book is heavy on this is what to do. So let's say we have 2 school-age siblings, maybe 6 and 8, because I think that's a pretty common time of a lot of bickering. And they seem to be constantly bickering when spending time together at home. And sometimes the older one will physically hurt the younger one. You have these 3 phases of how to tackle conflict. So if you could present each phase and then apply it to this scenario, I think that would be helpful.
Sure. The first thing is when kids are fighting a lot with each other, like you're describing, is especially if there's physical aggression, the no violence rule. But let me talk a little bit about how to get there.
Yep.
The first thing is that I recommend parents first become researchers into when their children are fighting and how it kind of goes down, because a lot of times sibling fighting is related to the time of day and transitions, particularly when kids get right home from school. They've been kind of keeping it together all day at school, and they might have no gas left in the tank to deal with another person and their needs. And so, that's often a time of heavy duty conflict, or in the morning when you're trying to rush them off. But the afternoon one in particular is often just related to them being hungry. And before you do anything, just get food in them. And often all those problems magically disappear. So you don't need to be like, you do any fancy interventions. We have a rule in my own house, which is we don't have any serious conversations until everybody's fed. I don't care what the issue is, because people just don't function well when they're hungry or overtired. And so make sure your kids are sleeping too. Once you do that, then if you've done that research, you can predict when things are going to erupt, and then you can develop a plan for how you're going to manage those times. So instead of winging it, which is, a fight is broken up, now I got to run into the room and I have to start yelling at them and, separating them and playing judge, which you really should not do. You have a plan. And the way you develop a plan, and you have to be on board with your parenting partner, your spouse usually, you map out what the behavior you would like to see happen at that time. And then if conflict emerges, what behaviors you would like to see them engage in when they disagree over something. And you go over it with the children. You have like a family meeting and you say, and if they're older, you can even ask them for ideas. And 6 and 8, you could probably start asking them for ideas. When they're younger, parents pretty much have to make the rules. And then you say, okay, so from now on, when you're fighting over snacks, or, somebody is chewing too loudly or something like that, when that happens, this is what I would like to see instead. And you can talk about, taking turns getting snacks. You can talk about sharing. You can talk about whatever you think will work best in your family. Maybe Monday, you get to pull out the snacks. Tuesday, the other child pulls out the snacks. If you have trouble with them eating, instead of saying like, oh my God, you're so gross, why do you always eat that way? Here's a more productive way. You can either get up and move to another room, or you can say, can you please stop chewing so loudly? Or you can come and talk to one of your parents and ask them to manage or help you with that. And so you give them an alternative behavior. And then when it goes down, like the problem happens, and it will, because just because you have the family meeting doesn't mean the siblings are going to stop fighting. So when they do fight over the snacks when they get home, you all you have to do then is say, do you remember the conversation we had and what we expect the rules are? And in those rules, you have rewards and or consequences, or both, right? And you say, if you do it, if you are able to follow through doing these things, here's what you get. And for most kids nowadays, it's like more time on your device or your phone or those kind of things. And if you don't do it, here's the consequence. You lose time on your device. And so when they start to fight, you stop them and say, no, remember what we talked about. What are you supposed to do now? And then if they do engage in the behavior, you have to remember to, one, praise it like crazy, like, I'm so proud of you guys, you're being awesome, and so on. And two, make sure they get the reward that you talked about.
Right.
And if they don't, then this is probably the most important thing I can recommend to parents. And parents, you have to also emotionally regulate yourself. You have to be calm. But you is to say, oh, you guys, you're not doing what we talked about. I'm going to give you one more opportunity to try again. And then this way they have a chance to think about, okay, what is it that I want to do? And if they do the behavior, again, praise it and reward it. And if they don't, then you go, okay, you're not doing what we talked about. And so now the consequence is this, and then implement the consequence. And it may take a few times because, sometimes old habits die hard. So don't get thrown if it doesn't work the first or second time. Keep at it. And then, life will get easier for you as you go, because now they're going to engage in the behavior that you want. And when they are sharing with each other and they're taking turns and they're not insulting each other about the way they eat and so on, they actually start to like each other more. And the more siblings like each other, there's more air in the relationship to make mistakes. And so you can say something dumb, or you can grab the cookie first, and the other sibling might not react quite as intensely anymore because there's more of a connection.
Yeah, that's a great point. I really love the part about let's have a do-over or try again. So it gives them that chance in the moment, especially with younger kids or neurodivergent kids who have impulse control problems and really aren't going to remember that conversation in the moment.
That's so true.
Right.
I'm really glad that you brought that up. Yeah, it's so true. I remember my own one of my own kids, when very young, would come into the room and say, "Get me some water," and I would say, "Go out and try it again."
Yeah.
And then they would come back and they go, "Can I please have a glass of water?" And I was like, "Oh, so you did it." But can you imagine if like my first reaction is like, "What did you say to me? You're not my boss." Right. Yeah, I'm not. And then all of a sudden you got this huge negative interaction between the two of you. And for what? I mean, there's an opportunity to learn how to do it right. And, when you're learning anything, you're going to be clumsy at first. So,
yeah, I love the idea of parents doing it and saying, like, if they lose their temper, to say, you know what, I'm going to have a do-over. I'm going to try that again. And we can model it for our kids too. I think it's a great concept. The other strategy that I loved is during the dispute, as you're kind of revisiting the rules you've set out, is the question, what could you have done differently to get what you wanted? So not just what could you have done differently, which I think is pretty common, but really validating that the child has a need and a want that is frustrated. So to focus in on that, I think is a great tool for parents. Or asking how each child could get what they want while also having their sibling end up happy too. So how can both of you feel okay about this or get what you want? Do you have any ideas? And I've done that with my kids, and it is surprising how it can work, because then they're invested when they realize they can get what they want.
Yeah, kids have emotions. And, if we only focus on their behaviors, we only make it harder for ourselves. we have to also validate and understand that they're young and they're still trying to figure out the world. And sometimes it's really frustrating. And we have to acknowledge that as we're trying to figure out what is the right behavior here.
Yeah, it's blending the behavioral approach and intervention with the rewards, consequences, clear rules with the emotional connection and really trying to understand the emotional drives and experience. One thing I see a lot in my clinical practice and working with parents is often one child gets framed as the aggressor and the other child is the victim, and usually the older versus the younger, right? And then it, as we've been talking about, creates this distance between the siblings and between the parent and the older sibling. How do you approach that?
Yeah, so it starts really early, right? And so I'm going to give you a little bit more of a complex answer, I guess, maybe that you were looking for. But, when kids are really little, like firstborns, and then the secondborn comes into the picture, they sometimes act aggressively towards the child because it's new and it's taking a lot of attention and so on. And so they might go over and like slap the child or say, I don't want this child around anymore. Or they might rip up one of their toys or whatever. And, the parent wants to protect the baby. But if they do that and say like, what's wrong with you? Don't do that to your brother, sister. It actually causes more of this resentment and hostility that they've been displaced. They were like on the inside and now they're an outsider. And they're now saying to them, you are an outsider and the baby's an insider. And so it starts this pattern of aggressor and victim. And it only gets reinforced by the parent's intervention. If the parent, and a lot of parents do this, were to say, no, you're not allowed to hit, you're not allowed to do those things. That's not acceptable behavior. But what I would like you to do is, help me with your younger brother or sister. You can bring me the diapers, or this is how you feed them, and this is how you hold the bottle, and this, and then, lots of parents will buy their kids like, Big Brother T-shirts or things like that. And they kind of bring them as an insider, almost as like a third parent. And, when you see, now that seems like easy to do when a child is like 3 or 4 and the baby is, but now when it's like 12 and 9, it's the same exact kind of thing. Like, no, you don't respond that way. You don't hit or insult or do those things. But rather, you seem like you're frustrated and angry about something. Let's talk about it. And you bring them in as an insider and make them feel like you're invested in them and interested in them. And, and then you can talk about next time you're feeling this way, hitting or pushing or name calling isn't allowed. And then you can have the conversation that you raise, which is, what do you think is a better way to do this to express your frustration in the moment?
Right. So I like the framework of insider outsider, because I think if parents can see that a child who may be consistently getting in trouble for how they're treating their sibling is feeling like an outsider. And like we talked about before, there's that loop of the more they do it, the more of an outsider they are because they're getting that negative feedback. But then that negative feedback reinforces them doing it more and more. So I just like the image of a child feeling on the outside. And so how do we pull them back in with clear boundaries around safety and physical aggression and verbal aggression not being permitted? Yet we validate your frustration and what's going on for you and want to help figure out a better way.
Yeah. And that, I'm here for you as a parent. I'm not just here to criticize and punish your aggression.
Right.
I can see that I'm going to see that as also a position of struggle. Right. And so, I want to be your ally. So let's have a conversation about how I can best be helpful for you too, without you engaging in that.
We're working together instead of against each other.
Exactly. Which is why, it is important to have one-on-one time with your kids, because if you don't, having those conversations is really hard.
Well, that's validating, because as a therapist, that's often what I recommend when there are these problems, is to invest in the one-on-one connection between the parent and the child that's having a lot of conflict. Is where can you spend time together outside of the family unit in a way that is all about connecting
And just to make sure everybody's aware of this too, is those smaller children who are pretending to be the victims, sometimes they're pretending to be the victims because they get rewarded for it because they know the parent is going to have their back, and they will instigate with the older sibling to get things going because it's ultimately going to win favor for them.
Right. And they get that insider position with their parent. Yep. Okay. I have a couple of quick questions for you for different scenarios. What if siblings are just really different people and aren't cut out to be close? Is that even a fair assumption? Or how can we as parents recognize this and then manage that in our family?
First of all, kids are not the same. And, even in research, we see that siblings are very, very different from each other typically. And part of what we were discussing earlier is that parents actually overemphasize or overstate how different their children are, which only reinforces differences more. But just because you're different from somebody doesn't mean that you can't be friends or get close to them. Lots of people have different interests than their spouses and friends and so on, and yet they still manage to have good relationships. And so, although you might not be engaged in the same activities, there are usually other places that kids can spend time together and enjoy each other's company, and when they're all together with the family and so on. I think the differences end up being used as an excuse about, why we're fighting with each other rather than relationship skills.
Okay, that's a good distinction.
Teaching pro-social skills is more important than finding common interest.
Excellent, concise response to a big question. So I have another one.
Okay.
I just want to touch on the parent experience in terms of what we may be bringing from our childhood, whether it could be that we had a highly contentious relationship with a sibling, we're not close with our sibling, or we grew up as an only child and the sibling relationship thing feels very foreign. So I'm just curious, from your 30 years of doing this work, what you may see with the parents' own experience growing up and what to be aware of maybe as we parent our children.
I don't think it would be breaking news for anybody to learn that, our own experiences growing up inform the way that we parent. And, if we did have contentious relationships with our siblings growing up, we might just expect that that's normal for our kids. Number two is that we may inadvertently support it because we weren't really exposed to behaviors to promote positive relationships. And so even our efforts to do that, if they're well-intended, which they almost always are, may fall flat. But there's other ways in which that shows up too. So for example, in families where there's lots of favoritism, or as family therapists like to refer to it, triangulation, that it operates in a multi-generational way. And so siblings that were very competitive over parental favor now have their own kids and are now comparing their kids to their siblings' kids and, vying for attention from the grandparents. And so you see all that kind of complexity being handed down as well. And I often hear from only child parents who say, I just don't know what to do. This is like, I've never had to face these situations before. Yeah. It's almost like they're aliens landing on the planet going, what is this sibling thing? Because it is complex and it's very intense. And, sometimes just talking about what siblings are and what sibling relationships could look like. And again, being on the same team as your spouse or co-parent is super important. And that's often where it shows up, because one parent will say, this is the way it was when I was growing up. And the other parent will say, oh, this is the way when I was growing up. Let them fight it out. No, don't let them fight it out. And, and then all bets are off.
Right. Yeah. Everyone's misaligned at that point.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think there is, just with all things parenting, having that awareness of what we're bringing into it, how it may change our response. So like you said, normalizing a lot of conflict, if that's what we grew up with, when it shouldn't be normalized, we should be paying attention to it. Or I think there could be an overcorrection, especially I grew up essentially as an only child, and I felt like all conflict is bad. Like, what is happening? Why are they at each other's throats like this? And my kids have said to me, you don't know. Like, this is normal. We're fine. You overreact so much. So do you see that too, where there may be overcorrection? We haven't really talked about that piece of it.
No, we haven't. And that's a really interesting question. And it happens all the time in parenting where, people who feel like their parents were overly strict become overly permissive or vice
Yep.
versa, and it certainly, I'm sure shows up like that in sibling relationships too. Yeah. It's something I'm going to have to keep an eye out for because I haven't really thought about it that much, but in regard to siblings, um, but I've actually seen it show up a lot in spouses. And I'll just say something very short about that, which is like, I had this couple once I was working with where the husband grew up in a family where he was always like the superstar and, he was the golden child and so on. And the wife grew up sort of as the outsider, middleborn, not that I want to stereotype middleborns this way, but kind of felt like, she was, not really appreciated so much. And he came home one day and he said, I just got promoted at work and I'm so excited. And she said, oh, sure. The sun just shines for you wherever you go. You're always so lucky. You just get whatever you want, right? Which is exactly the worst thing you can say to your spouse when they got promoted because they want you to join in their excitement and say, I'm so proud of you and that's so awesome. But, that those old patterns of favoritism just showed right up for her, which was, you're a favorite. And so you get whatever you want always, and I'm not, and life is not that easy for me. And so it started a fight between them. And it really, that was the old childhood stuff that was emerging in that relationship. And you do see that sometimes in parenting too, where, if you felt like you were always the child who was on the outside and one child seems to be doing really well, you might purposely try to overcorrect for the struggling child and even, not recognize the accomplishments of the successful one because you're worried that it might make the other child feel worse. And so you don't say anything about those kind of ways.
Yeah. It is all so complicated.
Somebody's right about it.
We can't. Yeah. So go read the book and then it won't be complicated anymore. No.
Yeah. Right.
But I think I want to end on the note of family relationships are incredibly complicated and there is so much richness to them, obviously, and so much potential for really adding to our quality of life and long-term health and happiness when we are cultivating healthier relationships. But it's hard work and it's not a straight, easy line. There's a lot of dips and valleys. And I think as you started, and you do this in your book too, you're very compassionate towards parents. And you talked at the beginning of our conversation about the grace for us to have for ourselves in this whole journey.
It's so important. Yeah. Self-compassion about our parenting. We're just doing the best that we can.
Yeah.
And there's so much to learn and pay attention to. And the more kids you have, the more moving parts there are.
Yeah.
And so, and if we mess up, like you said, you can always go back and say, you know what? I wasn't thrilled with the way I handled that. Let's talk about it and let's get back on track. And that's the beautiful thing about relationships is if you mess them up, you can go back.
Yeah.
But, can I add one more thing that we didn't touch on?
Yes, please. I was going to ask you that actually. What did we miss?
This is super, super important. So I want to make sure that if parents want, and I just had somebody ask me this question the other day. I was actually at the gym and a parent actually said, oh my God, my kid has temper tantrums every time he misses a basket when we're playing one-on-one, and just like, what do I do? Is pay attention and reinforce the good moments. So, when your kids are playing together in a room, and this is typically what we do as parents, they go together in a room and they're playing and they're quiet and we're like, oh, good. Now I get to go like fold the laundry or wash the dishes or catch up on emails or right. And then we miss all the good stuff. And then when they start screaming, we go, now you got to go in and deal with it. Yeah. But meanwhile, they're sharing with each other, they're complimenting, they're perspective taking, they're doing all the things that make for good, positive relationships. And if we pay attention to those and we say, I love the way you two are sharing and you're playing with each other and, you invest in the good moments, you'll get so much more of those. Because when we only kind of pay attention to the negative moments, those are the ones that the kids learn. This is how we get mom and dad involved.
Yep. And attention.
Yeah. And it's really like, that's So like what I said to the dad on the basketball court is stop paying attention to the temper tantrums.
Yeah.
And, every time he tells you like, oh, you made a good shot, and he high fives and, or he says, okay, I missed it, but I'll get it next time.
Right. Notice
And say, great, I'm so proud of you. That's awesome. Like go for the good stuff and don't give so much energy to the negative stuff. And it will turn. And then all of a sudden you'll see they're happier, you're happier, and life is more peaceful.
It's a great place to end. Thank you so much for sharing your lifetime, your career of wisdom with our audience at Psychologists Off the Clock. I want to remind listeners that we are doing our co-host debrief about the discussion about how we're really integrating this wisdom into our lives as parents. So stay tuned for that. But Jonathan, where can people find you?
Well, I'm not very good at the social media, but I just started an Instagram, and it's at Sibling Expert. I also have a website, which I have to be better at updating, but it's siblingexpert.com. And those are probably the best two places to find me and to reach out if you need.
And of course, your book is for sale.
Yeah, go find it, buy it, or take it out of your library. But I hope you enjoy it.
Thanks so much for the discussion today, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me. Great questions, and I really appreciated the time.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around for this co-host debrief. I am here with Jill to talk more about the conversation you just listened to with Jonathan Caspi about raising loving siblings. So, Jill, what was it like for you listening? I know you are currently raising siblings.
Yes. Well, I was so looking forward to this episode because I have siblings and I am raising siblings. And so I was just really curious to see what he had to say. And, I have one brother that I'm very close to, one I'm actually estranged from, who I've talked about on the podcast. And I just know, I know how sad it is to have lost a brother and just how much it fills my heart and soul to be close with my other brother. And so, of course, as a mom, I want nothing more than for my kids to have that with each other. And they bicker a lot, and it's hard not to feel a little bit of panic of oh no, what do I need to do to fix this so they can be close when they get older? And so it was just really great to get some actionable tools and skills from Jonathan. And I will say, I had one of those mic drop moments. And I feel like this happens so often where it's a mic drop moment, but also it's so obvious. And you're like, why didn't I ever realize this before? And it was when he talked about how it's so common for siblings to not get close until they move out of the home. And that was exactly how it was with my brother. And I assumed that happens because, if you don't live under the same roof anymore, there's nothing to really fight about. But he talked about the reason for that is because you're no longer living with your parents, and it's your parents
so
that
obvious.
are the ones, yes, that are kind of creating the issues in the sibling relationship. And that I knew the parent part, but I still just never made that connection.
Right. And I started the interview, obviously, now that you've heard it, with how I had to really be humble going into it, knowing as a therapist how much the parents are a part of much of the sibling bickering. But as a mom, it's so hard to hear that because, we feel like, well, we are doing our best, right? Every day. And sometimes that bickering can just put us over the edge. And we do exactly what he admits doing himself, which is to say, cut it out, knock it off. But that's not really solving anything in the long run. So I think as with all things parenting and life, it's holding both your long-term future vision for your children, along with the day-to-day of how can we function the best together.
Absolutely. Yes. And that once in a while, even when we have the new information, knowledge, skills, we're still going to say, knock it off once in a while.
Yeah. I know. I just spent
that's okay.
a week, with the family on a trip. So we had a lot of togetherness. So yes, I had Jonathan's words in my head as I was saying, stop it.
Right.
Just stop. But I also felt like I was practicing more of just not taking sides, not getting pulled into mom, and noticing how they would amp up the conflict when they were trying to get me involved.
Ooh, an extinction burst.
Yes. Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny, like when we can keep our own stuff in check and just leave it alone, they work it out.
Yeah.
And, like Jonathan said, if they're harming each other, if they're becoming violent, then of course, you do need to intervene. But if it's just words and volume, we can trust them to work it out. And I'm sure it's like different at different ages, but certainly my kids being 13 and 11, like they can figure it out, and they always do.
Yeah. And it's really better for everyone. The other piece of it that I've been really integrating is just really watching out for alliances and families. And that's both the families I work with in therapy, as well as my own family, of how some natural alliances can form if certain parents and kids kind of naturally get along better or have similar interests, but really looking out for then, where does the other child feel like an outsider, and being really sensitive to that.
Yeah, absolutely. That really stuck with me too. And, I can't remember if I've shared this on the podcast before, but where my daughter, this was a few years ago, she said, "Mommy, you and Liam are dogs and Daddy and I are cats."
Hey.
And it's so true. It was like the most spot on personality assessment ever. And so we do have that because my son and I are more like social and active. Like we like to be out and with people.
Right.
Whereas, my husband and my daughter prefer to be like kind of like quiet and homebodies and not with people. And so it is easy to sort of default into those areas. And then you inadvertently end up spending more time with one or potentially being closer to one. The other thing that really struck me, and I ended up sharing this with my kids, and they were pretty fascinated by it, actually. It's all the outcome data about the benefits of being friends with your siblings and how it's good for your health and you make more money. And, there was all that data of like all the ways that this is like a really positive thing in your life. And so that was just something I shared with them, hoping that they would find it interesting. And then, I don't know, it would just kind of like put the bug in there, like plant a seed that would make them, want to be motivated to kind of figure this out on their own.
Well, I'm so glad we finally have an episode about siblings. I feel like it's kind of an underestimated relationship in our lives that we don't talk enough about. And so
absolutely,
hopefully people have got a lot out of this, both for their adult sibling relationships and the sibling relationships they're cultivating as parents.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.